Hey guys, this is Anthony over at MMOBomb.com, and today I'll be doing a first look on Tower of Fantasy for PC. Just like previous first look videos, I'll guide you guys through the beginning hours and get into the nitty-gritty details to make sure you can decide if this game is worth your time or not. And as always, we'll hit all the major points so you can get a general feel for the in-game features, gameplay, and other areas, alongside weighing the positives and negatives. So without further ado, let's jump into today's review. Tower of Fantasy is free to play on Android, iOS, and PC. The game was advertised as a shared open world MMORPG that provides an anime-infused sci-fi adventure with gacha elements. The description is pretty accurate to what the game feels like, except the MMO part is a fraction of the player experience. Tower of Fantasy follows the trail of Genshin Impact's adaptation of the Breath of the Wild formula and feels like a title hoping to excel in this gacha era of Eastern free-to-play games. But in the process of becoming a competitor, much of Tower of Fantasy's identity is lost due to its fast-paced progression, unpolished performance, and how it tries so hard to beat so many games at once. Despite those setbacks, there are little nuggets of enjoyment with Tower of Fantasy, mostly coming from exploration and how the overall game feels free-to-play friendly. But before I get too deep into the details, we should start at the beginning of the game. The early experience of Tower of Fantasy, especially at launch on August 11th, was quite eventful for me. Finding a server to call home was a little bit of a nuisance, but expected for a game on launch day. What I didn't expect, however, was being forced to make a character on an Asia Pacific server called Babel. Other regions like North America were flooded with players. For example, one North American server had a queue time of 2 hours and over 200 people were waiting to get in. If you've been keeping tabs on server times for Tower of Fantasy, I'm here to tell you that everything you heard is true. The developers have addressed the server issues and will send players individual compensation such as cash app currencies and whatnot, so it's not all that bad. And there are plans to improve the server registration process and overall optimization when in-game. As for when it'll get better, I expect the game will start seeing some slack over the next couple of months. The reason I say this is because there are some time-gated systems in Tower of Fantasy, and it benefits players who continually play and stick with the game. For example, your day 1 level cap is level 18 and will increase each day until level 70 on day 88. There are even caps on EXP, quest caps locking you out of story content, level locked areas of the map, and other shenanigans to buffer how much a player can play. Thankfully, I was able to get all the time I needed with it before my first day's level cap. I will admit I was a bit salty when I got kicked from several servers on the North American side before going to Babel. But once I got in, I made a male character, I called him Clive, and I started making my husbando. I was really close to making a waifu. Really close. But instead I went for the cool, calm, and collected husbando character. Looking at the character creation system, it's about as anime as they come, in terms of how characters look, but also, it really does have a really good level of customization. You can choose from a list of pre-made characters or make your own from scratch. But the cool thing about the system is that players can make a character and save them for others to see. The more popular ones get upvoted and usually are recreations of well-known anime characters or long-time mascot characters like Shaggy from Scooby-Doo. Once you've decided if you're going to make a pre-made character or not, you can spruce up your character's hair, facial features, and outfit. Each section has different tabs to customize the area chosen to a moderate degree. From what I've seen, you can make a pretty unique character before starting the game, and it will feel different from others. The only downside is that, you might share the same outfit with another character out in the world. After making my husbando, we set off on a brand new adventure. Tower of Fantasy has a world straight out of an anime. The backstory is that mankind was facing an apocalyptic level crisis where resources dried up and forced them to flee Earth and start all over again on an alien planet called Ida. There, humans observed the comet called Mara and sought to contain the powerful energy within it called Omnium. This led to the Tower of Fantasy being created to capture Mara's energy, but due to the influence of omnium radiation, it basically infected the world. Whenever this radiation infects a human being, they transform into monsters. That's a basic summary of the game's backstory. As for the story though, it's a bit more complicated and honestly drawn out. In my opinion, I really didn't like the story events, and I barely liked the characters. I hate to keep saying this, but the game is like an anime. And when it comes to a lot of anime stories, there are always these tropes and dramatic moments that don't quite fit, or they just feel really flimsy. You got the overprotective brother, the shady group who are all edgy and mysterious. You got the overblown action sequences that really came out of left field. And all of that is coming at you like 100 miles per hour. Like bam, bam, bam. You're moving very fast through the game. So much so that I often stop doing the main quests to take time to explore the world myself. That's when the game became a bit more enjoyable, since there are scattered landmarks, plenty of chests to discover, training facilities to test your abilities, strongholds with beefy enemies, and a ton of items to collect for cooking. The verticality of the game's map was also a huge plus for me, because you could use a jetpack to go high into the air and get to some places that was hard to reach, and you could also use like a motorbike to kind of get across the world faster. And honestly, it just made the world feel much larger than it actually is. Then there are these things called ruins, which are inspired by Breath of the Wild's puzzle solving labyrinths around Hyrule. It lacks the depth of Breath of the Wild's design, and it tries to make up for it by having players use relics similar to the Sheikah Slate, and how it has like magnesium and all these like abilities with it to kind of help the player progress through the zone. The relics are serviceable though. I mean, they're not great like the Sheikah Slate, but it's not like you'll be solving the trickiest puzzles around, and you know, you're not really gonna be having a whole lot of big aha moments. So they're only really there to help you progress if there's like a wall or two that pops up and you know, you're kind of stuck. But as I traveled and I got, you know, around the area more and got more invested in, you know, the world and so on and so forth, of course combat was a factor in all that, and I just gotta say, combat for me was a mixed bag. Tower of Fantasy is easy, almost to the point of being boring, honestly. There's hardly any difficulty, and as for combat as a whole, I mean, it's flashy and cool the first few times, but after a while you start to notice how unpolished the animations are and how static combat feels in general. From what Tower of Fantasy advertised, it's probably likely that most of the combat challenges will be in group content, such as world bosses, but it will take some time to get the true endgame because of the time-gated systems. You know, we're looking at like 88 days before we reach 70. Despite how easy it is to solo so far, there are parts of combat that I actually do enjoy though. Probably the biggest highlight of combat is the counter system. When you dodge at just the right time, enemies within a circle around you are frozen for a few seconds. This ability is called Fantasia and gives you the opportunity to deal extra damage. Also, switching between your 3 weapons after they become charged through combat use will unleash a unique ability that's special to each weapon specifically. For anyone familiar with Honkai Impact 3rd, these combat features will feel very familiar. However, unlike Honkai, Tower of Fantasy's implementation of the features with combos feels stale and rigid. Also, weapons don't really stand out that much, honestly, besides, you know, the little visual effects and whatnot. But all in all, I mean, everything's either, you know, flashy boom big attack or a very quick fast kind of stealthy attack, but nothing really stand out like. This goes back to an earlier point of mine where I said Tower of Fantasy is trying to be other games a lot. It lacks a recognizable identity in combat and has followed what other games have done, but just not as effective. Which brings me to where a lot of the game's heated discussion is happening today: the gacha system. I'm not gonna debate over whether the gacha system is play to win or not, but I will say that the game has a very forgiving pity system, throws a ton of currencies at you from the beginning, and doesn't require a free-to-play player to invest money from what I've seen so far. Out of the many gacha games out there, Tower of Fantasy seems to be more on the acceptable side. But frankly, I believe all gacha games are predatory in nature, so no matter how easier it is to play without investing in a pool system, I think that it being there is still a negative for the game. In the case of Tower of Fantasy, players will pull weapons, which in turn pulls characters. Similar to Genshin Impact, weapons have rarities. The best ones are SSR in Tower of Fantasy. As an example, I pulled dual guns, which are Samir's signature weapons. So I got Samir and her weapons within that pool. The character in particular can be used as a simulacrum, which is a system of sorts that makes your main character look like the splitting image of that character. As complicated as that might sound, you can always stick with your main character you made and still use the weapons you pulled with no drawbacks. For once, Tower of Fantasy is one of the only big gacha games that makes it to where your main character isn't irrelevant in combat. Where things start to get a little shaky with the gacha system is PvP, and apparently Chinese players said there are meta combinations of SSR weapons that gives paying players an edge over free-to-play players. Open world PvP is one such example that shows the glaring disparity between both types of players. Yet in the Apex League, which is a ranked version of PvP that scales equipment, it hopes to balance things out and make things fair as opposed to the world PvP. As of now, there aren't any weapon metas to speak of in ranked play, but Chinese content creators have warned that future banners might introduce key SSR weapons that'll become best in slot for Apex League. With every feature Tower of Fantasy introduces, I can't help but feel that the game needed more time in the oven. There are actually a lot of great ideas and cool mechanics I could see flourishing as Tower of Fantasy gets older, but as it is right now, it wants to be everything else but itself. While its identity is in limbo, I do believe it can be an enjoyable side game that anyone could play casually. However, if you're looking for the Genshin killer, this is definitely not that game. It's an MMORPG with the Genshin part tacked on because, hey, big bucks. Which brings me to another point. The MMO aspect is near non-existent, except for, world boxes and PvP for the most part. There aren't any in-game features from the start that encourages you to venture out with people and complete content together. If anything, it's a single player game with the option of multiplayer. Though, just as I mentioned earlier for combat, group content is for way later in the game, past the time-gated systems, so your earlier experiences are going to be mostly solo. With that being said, I do believe the best way for Tower of Fantasy to start being its own type of game is to lean more into the MMO aspects in the future and build off of that. It needs to get far away from Genshin Impact, as much as it can anyway, because the level of polish between both games is night and day. That wraps up our first look on Tower of Fantasy for PC. If the game sounds like your cup of tea and you'd like to get your hands on it, check out Tower of Fantasy on the official website to download it for PC or on mobile devices and give it a shot. Once you do, be sure to let us know how your experience went down in the comment section. Also, thanks so much for watching today's review. If you're not already, subscribe to the channel for more content like this and give us a like. It goes a long way and we appreciate your support. This is Anthony with MMOBomb.com signing off.